Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I am really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, the ancient Egyptians built temples, festivals, and an entire priesthood devoted to appeasing Sekhmet, the very goddess who, according to their oldest records, once tried to destroy them all. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. Why would a civilization worship something that almost ended it? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a text that survives inscribed on the walls of burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings, copied across papyrus sheets that have crumbled to dust and been born again in translation, and it describes, with the same calm detachment one might use to record a flood season or a grain count, the moment a god decided that humanity deserved to end. The question that scholars have returned to across generations is not whether the event occurred in the literal sense. The question, the one that does not resolve cleanly, is why the record exists at all, why any civilization would encode, preserve, and eventually celebrate the account of its own near annihilation, why the very force that was sent to destroy the human world was subsequently given temples, festivals, priestesses, and the permanent protection of an entire theological system. Why the Egyptians, who were precise record keepers, who measured grain and flood levels and astronomical cycles with extraordinary care, would look at what they had written about Sekhmet and decide that it deserved not erasure but devotion. That question does not have a simple answer. And it is, in many ways, the reason the story of Sekhmet has endured for more than 3,000 years. Long after the civilization that built it has been reduced to stone and silence, there is also the matter of what the myth encodes about creation itself, about the relationship between a maker and what the maker makes, and the particular kind of responsibility that relationship carries. Re made Sekhmet. He made her powerful because a tool without power is no tool at all. He made her autonomous because an extension of his will that required his direct management of every action was not an extension of his will, but simply his will, operating through a different body. He made her capable of the full range of what the Eye of Re could mean: protection, destruction, punishment, restoration, because a force limited to only one of those functions would have been, in the Egyptian cosmological framework, incomplete. And then he sent her knowing she was all of those things. He sent her to do the specific one of those things he needed done. And what he could not account for, what the text seemed to record with the particular care of something that surprised even the civilization writing it down, was that a force capable of all of those things, once released, does not stop at the one thing it was sent to do. It continues. Because that is what a complete force does. It does not know proportion. It does not recognize the point at which punishment becomes something else. It only knows how to be fully what it is. And Re, who made it fully what it is, had to learn this the way the texts record everything, by watching it happen and then writing it down, and then building his civilization around the fact that he would never fully know how to stop it again. To understand what was recorded about Sekhmet, it is necessary to understand the world in which she was conceived, not as metaphor, but as architecture. The ancient Egyptians did not separate the divine from the physical. The sky was not a symbol of something greater. It was the body of Nut, arching across the earth each night, swallowing the sun and giving birth to it again at dawn. The Nile was not simply water. It was the blood of a system so finely balanced that any disruption, too much flood, too little, a poor harvest, a plague, a dynasty collapse, was understood as evidence that something in the divine order had shifted. The gods were not remote. They were embedded in the fabric of daily life with a specificity that the modern world does not have an adequate framework to hold. To be Egyptian was to live inside a theology that was not a set of beliefs held separately from existence, but the operating logic of existence itself. The river was divine, the soil was divine. The sun crossing the sky was not an astronomical event, but a god, alive, maintaining the world through the act of moving across it, and requiring the cooperation of the living to keep moving at all. Re, the sun god, occupied the apex of this system. His passage across the sky each day was not automatic, it was maintained. It required ritual, prayer, sacrifice, and the cooperation of a vast celestial bureaucracy to ensure that the solar bark made its journey from horizon to horizon without incident. Every morning that the sun rose was, in the logic of this world, a victory. Every night it set safely was a trial survived. Re was old, older than the other gods in the Egyptian reckoning, and the texts describe him in his later existence with a weariness that is surprisingly human. His bones had become silver. His flesh had become gold. His hair had become lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone quarried from distant mountains and traded at great cost. He was still powerful, still sovereign, but the texts do not describe him as infallible. They describe him as something that had existed so long it had grown heavy with the weight of it. And it is that heaviness, that accumulated age, pressing down on even a god, that the surviving texts identify as the condition in which Re made the decision he could not take back. It was in this condition, ancient, slowing, still divine, but no longer untouchable, that Re became aware of something that, in any other system, might have been managed quietly. The humans he had created were speaking against him. The translations vary, and scholars have debated the precise meaning for decades. Some read it as rebellion, some read it as mockery. Some suggest the original text implies something closer to conspiracy, that humanity had begun to whisper among themselves that Re was diminishing, that his power was no longer absolute, and that they might, perhaps, act accordingly. The Egyptian word used in the source texts carries a weight that does not translate cleanly into any modern language. It is not simply disobedience. It is something closer to a fundamental rupture in the order of things, a crack in the structure that holds everything in place. And for a civilization that understood itself to be the living embodiment of cosmic order in a world surrounded on all sides by chaos, a crack in that structure was not a philosophical matter. It was an emergency. Reconvened what the texts describe as a great assembly. The gods gathered Shu, god of air, Tefnut, goddess of moisture, Geb, the earth, Nut, the sky, Nun, the primordial waters from which all things had emerged. They gathered, according to the record, in secret, so that the humans would not know what was being decided about them. This detail is preserved with unusual specificity in the surviving texts. The secrecy matters. It suggests that whatever was about to be determined, the gods understood it to be consequential in a way that required concealment. A decision made in secret is a decision its makers are uncertain of. And what Re asked of his assembled council was, even by the standards of a civilization that had written about enormous, world-altering events with the same composed hand it used to record tax records, extraordinary. He asked them what should be done about the humans. The council's answer, as it has been preserved, is brief. They told him to send his eye. The Eye of Re is one of the most discussed and least fully understood concepts in all of Egyptian theological literature. It appears across texts spanning more than 2,000 years, in contexts that range from protection to destruction to cosmic maintenance. At its most fundamental level, it is an extension of Re's own power, a force that can be sent out from him to act in the world independently, that carries his authority but operates with its own volition. In some texts, the I is explicitly identified with specific goddesses. Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty and music, Mut, Wajet, and Sekhmet, whose name, in the ancient Egyptian language, derives from a root meaning power, meaning strength, meaning, in its most direct translation, the one who is powerful. The council told Re to send what he had already made, the most dangerous thing he possessed, the thing he had created and, until that moment, had never fully released. She is depicted in every surviving image with the head of a lioness, not a domesticated animal, not a creature of the household or the farm. A lion, the apex predator of the world the Egyptians knew, an animal associated with the killing heat of the desert, with the dry wind that came off the western sands and withered everything it touched, with the absolute, indifferent authority of a force that does not negotiate. Her skin is red in the surviving paintings, the color of heat, the color of the sun at its most dangerous, when it sits low on the horizon and seems to burn the earth itself. She carries a solar disk above her lion's head, surrounded by the Uraeus cobra, and in many depictions she holds the Ankh, the symbol of life, in one hand and Awa's scepter, representing divine power, in the other. Before she became what the texts describe her becoming in this account, she was a healer. The physicians of ancient Egypt, a profession deeply intertwined with priestly function, operated under her protection. Disease was understood as the arrows of Sekhmet, and it was therefore Sekhmet's priests who were best equipped to negotiate their withdrawal. She caused illness, and she cured it. She brought plague, and she could be petitioned to lift it. The arrow and the physician, the fever and the cure. But on the day Ray sent her down to the human world, the healing aspect of her nature was not what the situation called for. She was sent as punishment. She was sent as the eye, and she descended into the human world with the full weight of divine authority behind her, and she began. The texts do not describe what the humans did when they first became aware of what was among them. There is no record of flight or assembly or prayer. There is only the description of what Sekhmet did, rendered in language that is restrained in a way that makes it somehow more affecting than explicit horror would be. She moved across the land, and where she moved, the consequences were absolute. The geography of ancient Egypt is useful here as a frame of reference. The land itself, the two lands, as the Egyptians called the combination of Upper and Lower Egypt, was defined by its narrowness. The Nile ran through it like a spine, and on either side of the Nile stretched the cultivated land, the black earth called Kemet, from which the country took one of its oldest names. Beyond the cultivated land, with very little transition, the desert began, the red land, the Deshret, the world of heat and silence, and the creatures that lived in it, scorpions, serpents, lions. The two lands were, in their physical form, a thin ribbon of life threaded through an enormous emptiness. Their settlements were along the river, their farms were along the river, their temples were along the river. Everything that mattered to the human population of this world existed in a corridor that could, at its widest points, be crossed in a day's walk. Sekhmet moved through this corridor. The texts describe what she left in a single word that translates, depending on the scholar, as destruction, as desolation, as something that has been unmade. They do not elaborate beyond that word. The elaboration is not needed. In a civilization that understood itself to exist in a thin strip of order surrounded on all sides by chaos, the suggestion of something passing through that strip and undoing it carries a weight that requires no additional detail. The stone walls of the temples that would later be built in her honor carry images of her in this state, not graphic, not explicit, but unmistakable. The posture of an animal that has not been disturbed from what it is doing, the stillness of something that does not need to hurry, what she moved through did not fight back. The texts imply, in their careful language, that by the time there was awareness of her presence, the time for that response had already passed. And still she continued, day into night into day. The solar disk above her leonine head was not separate from the sun that burned across the Egyptian sky. She was, in the theology, an expression of the same force, turned inward, turned downward, turned against the very civilization that lived under it. The killing heat of the desert summer, the searing wind from the west, the fever that took hold without warning in the body of a person who had seemed entirely well that morning, all of these were understood, in the Egyptian framework, as arrows, her arrows, not random, not impersonal, sent. And in this period that the texts describe, she was not sending arrows, she was present, moving through the black earth, between the river and the desert, through the settlements of mud brick and limestone, through the cultivated fields and the irrigation channels, through the places where the humans she had been sent to punish had built what small, fragile, careful lives they could manage In the narrow band of life their world allowed, the heat of the land pressed down. The dust lay still. Whatever sound the two lands usually held, the movement of the river, the call of the ibis, the low noise of working settlements had gone somewhere else. Only she moved, and she did not stop. There is a quality to the texts in this section that scholars have described in various ways as procedural. The narration does not linger. It does not elaborate on what is being lost or what the humans are experiencing. It moves forward with the same even pace it uses to describe the convening of the council and the sending of the messengers. Something is being documented, not performed. And this quality, this refusal to insert emotion or horror into what is being recorded, has the effect, paradoxically, of making the account more rather than less affecting. The reader's imagination, given the shape of the event without its content, fills the space with something that no explicit description could achieve. A land being moved through by something that does not stop. A force that the text refused to limit by putting it into words. The black earth of the Kemet, the land of life, becoming the red land, the Deshret, the land of death, not at the borders where those two worlds usually met, but at the center, in the corridor where everything the civilization was had been built. The texts record what she found there with a sparseness that is more unsettling than description would be. They record what she consumed. They record that she did not stop at what a punishment by any reasonable theological accounting would have required. They record that she continued past the point of correction into something else, a state that the Egyptian theological vocabulary describes with a precision modern language struggles to replicate. She was in the blood. Not as metaphor. The texts are not using the language of metaphor here. She was consuming what she was destroying, and the consuming was becoming the reason for the destroying, and the destroying was becoming self-perpetuating in a way that had moved entirely outside the original intention of the God who sent her. She was the eye. She had been opened. And an eye, once fully opened to something, cannot simply be told to close. What the texts do record, in unusual specificity, is Re's response to what he observed. He looked down, and the solar theology of ancient Egypt gives Re a particular, elevated vantage point from which the entirety of the two lands would be visible, and he saw what Sekhmet was doing. And what the texts record next is the detail that separates this account from a simple destruction myth, and makes it something considerably more unsettling. Re had not expected this. The God who had created the humans, who had convened the council, who had made the decision and sent the eye, he had not anticipated what it would look like when the decision was carried out. The texts do not use the word regret. The language is too composed, too formal, too careful for that. But what is recorded is that Re looked at what was happening below him and determined that it needed to stop, that the punishment had exceeded whatever original proportion he had intended, that something he had set in motion with the full authority of his divine will was now operating beyond his ability to simply recall it, a God who had made something, a God who had sent it, a God who now stood above the world and watched it work, and could not find the command that would make it stop. This is the moment the story becomes something other than a myth of divine punishment, because what emerges from the texts at this point is not a God correcting a mistake with effortless power. It is a God who has created something he cannot control, confronting the consequences of that creation and having to resort, and this word is used deliberately, to deception. Re could not stop her. The solar God, the creator, the sovereign of the Egyptian cosmic order, did not have a mechanism to recall the eye once it had been opened to this degree. He could not command her to cease, because the texts imply clearly that command was no longer the operating language between them. She had passed into something that did not respond to authority, something that could only be redirected, never ordered. And so, fearful, the texts suggest, in the way that only a being who has realized the full limits of their own power can be fearful, began to think like something other than a god. He began to think like something that needs to survive. This shift in the narrative from divine authority to mortal seeming desperation is one of the reasons the Sekhmet account has drawn so much sustained, scholarly attention. Egyptian mythology is not, in the main, a literature of divine failure. The gods of the Egyptian pantheon are powerful, complex, sometimes capricious, sometimes in conflict with one another, but they are rarely depicted as helpless in relation to their own creations. The moment Ray recognizes that Sekhmet is beyond his command is a genuinely unusual moment in Egyptian theological literature. And the fact that it was preserved rather than edited out, that every version of the account that has survived keeps this detail intact, suggests that the Egyptians understood it to be essential to the meaning of the story, a myth in which Re simply orders Sekhmet to stop, and she stops, teaches nothing. A myth in which Re finds that his authority ends somewhere, that there is a point past which even the supreme deity cannot simply issue a command and expect the world to comply, teaches something the Egyptians apparently believed was worth encoding in stone and carrying into the tombs of their kings. Reordered beer produced in quantities the texts describe as something entirely beyond the ordinary. 7,000 jars. The number appears in the account that has been most widely translated and analyzed, and it is not treated as symbolic, it is treated as logistical. 7,000 jars of beer, and while the production was underway, Re sent messengers to the region of Elephantine, the island at the first cataract of the Nile in the far south of the country. The texts specify this messengers, swift runners, dispatched south for a specific plant. The translation of the plant's name has been debated across scholarly generations. Most favor a variety of mandrake, a plant with documented sedative properties that was known in the ancient world and has been found in Egyptian archaeological contexts, including, notably, in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The plant was brought north with urgency, across hundreds of miles of river, and when it arrived, it was incorporated into the fermenting beer before the jars were sealed. Into each jar, before fermentation was complete, the red mineral hematite was also introduced, that iron-bearing stone whose ground powder turned liquid the precise, deep, dark color of what Sekhmet was consuming in the fields below. The hematite is the detail that archaeological examination has returned to repeatedly. Red ochre, hematite, and various iron oxides were all used as pigments in ancient Egypt, and they have been found in contexts ranging from cosmetic use to ritual application to the painting of tomb walls. The use of hematite specifically to dye the beer red is, within the logic of the plan Re was executing, crucial because the deception depended entirely on Sekhmet not recognizing that what she was about to encounter was not what it appeared to be. The liquid had to look like what she had been consuming. From a distance, in the early light of whatever hour this was, in the state she was in, it had to be indistinguishable. This was not a divine intervention in any sense the word usually implies. This was a calculated deception, executed with the same care a general might give to a tactical problem in the dark. The god of creation, planning like an animal that has been cornered. Making something that looked like one thing, because the thing that needed to be stopped could not be reasoned with, could only, possibly, be fooled. The scale of the preparation is worth sitting with for a moment. 7,000 jars of beer is not a number that emerges casually from the ancient world. Brewery excavations at Egyptian sites, including the large-scale production facilities identified at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, among the oldest such facilities ever found, suggest that the Egyptians were capable of producing beer in industrial quantities, and that they had been doing so since the earliest periods of their civilization. Beer was not brewed in small household batches alone. It was produced in centralized operations that supplied workers, temples, and state functions. The texts that record Ray's order for 7,000 jars are, within this context, describing something that was logistically imaginable, not a fantasy quantity, but a number that would have required a significant mobilization of existing production infrastructure, operated under urgency, through a night, with the precise addition of a dye that had to be sourced, ground, and incorporated correctly to achieve the color that the deception required. The practicality of the detail is, in some ways, what makes it most strange. This is not the language of miracle. This is the language of emergency logistics. The texts record that Re himself went ahead of Sekhmet in the night. While she continued in one part of the land, Re caused the 7,000 jars of red beer to be poured out across the fields ahead of her path. The word used for what happened to the fields when the liquid was poured describes them as flooded, the same word used for the Nile inundation, that annual event on which all Egyptian agriculture depended. The fields ahead of Sekhmet were flooded to the depth, the texts specify, of 3 palms. This is not an imprecise number. 3 palms was a specific measurement in ancient Egyptian metrology, approximately 22 centimeters, a depth that would not simply pool on the surface, but would spread and saturate, turning the earth a dark, wet red in the pre-dawn hours before she arrived. Re moved through the night ahead of her, making sure the fields were ready, making sure the color was right. The texts imply the intention was that she would encounter it before anything else lay in her path. And then he waited. The texts describe something in this waiting that does not have a clean theological category. A god. Above a field he is prepared, waiting to see if something he made will be fooled by something he made. The distance between divine sovereignty and that moment is one of the most striking passages in all of surviving Egyptian literature. And then Sekhmet arrived. She came to the flooded fields in the earliest part of the time before dawn, when the sky over the eastern desert was not yet light but had begun its long transition from black to the deep bruised tone that precedes color. The fields ahead of her were dark and wet and red. The air above them carried the smell of fermentation, sharp, yeasty, warm, mixed with the mineral scent of the hematite, that iron note that sits at the back of the throat like something ancient. The text records something that is, in its way, the strangest single beat in the entire account, that Sekhmet, arriving at the flooded fields, was pleased. The word used is unambiguous in the surviving translations. She was delighted by what she found. She saw the expanse of red across the land, the smell of it, the color of it, the sheer quantity of it, catching the first gray of the coming dawn. And she lowered her lion's face to it, and she drank. She drank until the fields were dry. And then she could no longer stand. What happened in those hours from the moment the lion's face lowered to the red surface of the fields, to the moment she finally lay still, is described in the texts with the economy of a record that has no interest in spectacle. The beer spread across her muzzle and into the dust around her as she moved through what Re had prepared. The quantity of liquid was immense. 7,000 jars poured across a flooded plain, and she moved through it steadily, the way a force of nature moves through a landscape, without urgency and without pause, consuming what was in front of her, as she had been consuming everything else. The difference this time was what the consuming contained. The plant from elephantine had been dissolved into the fermentation. The sedative properties it carried were not immediate, they were cumulative. The texts do not specify the duration between the first contact and the moment she could no longer stand, but they describe the progression in terms that suggest a gradual withdrawal, not a sudden stop, but a slowing. The speed of her movement through the fields reduced. The purposefulness of her direction became less certain. And then there was the ground, and she was on it, and the sky above the 2 lands was beginning its first gray shift toward morning, and the land was quiet, in a way it had not been quiet for longer than the texts were willing to quantify. The texts do not describe her collapse with drama. They record it with the same composed plainness they use for everything else. She drank. The beer contained the plant from elephantine. She became unable to see the faces of the humans she had been destroying. And the killing stopped. Not because Re commanded it, not because a greater power intervened. Because the thing he had created, the thing he could not recall or override or restrain by any means available to a god, had been given exactly what it wanted, and what it wanted had not been what it appeared to be. The fields dried. The sky completed its turn from dark to light. The lion-headed goddess lay in the red-stained earth of the 2 lands, and the land around her was, for the first time in however long the texts declined to specify, quiet, still. The birds came back to the edge of the water. The dust settled. The silence that had been full of something was now simply silence. What the texts record next is what Re said when he looked at her when he looked at the goddess lying in the flooded field, her lion's face resting against the red-stained earth, the solar disk tilted above her, still there, still hers, and what he said, in the words that have survived 3,000 years of translation and reinterpretation, was something that stops the account cold. He said, in the most common translation, "How beautiful she is," or, in some versions, "How sweet her coming." Scholars have spent considerable time with those words. They appear at first to be an expression of relief, the crisis averted, the danger past, the God who had lost control of his own creation, able finally to breathe again. But the words are the words of admiration, and they are addressed to the creature that had just spent an indeterminate period undoing everything Re was supposed to protect. They are addressed to something that had operated completely outside his authority, that had required deception rather than divine command to stop. And Re's response to seeing her like that spent, red-stained, finally still was to call her beautiful. This too is preserved in the record, not corrected, not amended, preserved exactly as it was written, in the tombs of the most powerful people the ancient world produced. Sekhmet, when she woke, was no longer in the state the texts had described. The blood fury, the driving compulsion, the inability to stop whatever the plant from Elephantine had done to the fermenting beer, and whatever that combination had done to the goddess who consumed it, the texts agree that when she returned to full consciousness, she was Sekhmet again in the way she had been before. Re sent her dangerous, powerful, but no longer beyond reach, no longer outside the system. The transition is not explained. The texts do not describe what she thought or said or felt when she became aware of where she was and what had happened. They record only that she was again what she had been, and that the crisis was over, and that Re then did something that the myth records with the same factual directness it uses for everything else. He rewarded the thing that had almost destroyed him with institutions of permanent reverence, and Re declared, according to the surviving record, that henceforth there would be festivals in her honor. He declared that beer would be produced and consumed at these festivals as an act of appeasement, a reenactment of the event that had ended the destruction, coded as celebration rather than as the crisis management it had actually been. The festival of Sekhmet and the related festival of drunkenness associated with Hathor, the two goddesses, being so closely linked in Egyptian theology that they could, in certain texts, occupy the same role, became part of the formal religious calendar of ancient Egypt. These were not minor observances. They were serious, institutionally supported events. Re did not simply survive the crisis. He built a permanent infrastructure around the memory of it. As if the correct response to having nearly lost everything was not to distance yourself from what had caused it, but to schedule annual encounters with it, supervised, ritualized, controlled in the specific way that the original event had not been controlled, and to make sure that the encounter involved enough beer that everyone understood what they were commemorating and why. Priests were trained specifically in the management of Sekhmet's wrath. Not metaphorically, this was a real professional category in ancient Egyptian religious life. The priests of Sekhmet were expected to know how to petition her, how to recognize the signs of her displeasure, how to negotiate, through ritual, the withdrawal of plague or illness or disaster. They were physicians, and they were theologians, and they were, in a sense, the institutional memory of the event. The myth described the people whose professional existence was premised on the assumption that what had happened once could happen again, and that the only defense against it was a permanent, organized, well-funded apparatus of appeasement, not hope, not prayer alone. A system. A system built to manage something that the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon had been unable to simply command into compliance. The temples built in her honor were not small. At Memphis, at Karnak, at Luxor, at the major centers of Egyptian religious life, Sekhmet received cult statues and dedicated spaces. The sheer number of Sekhmet statues that have been excavated is remarkable. At the temple precinct of Mut at Karnak, archaeologists working across Excavation seasons, beginning in the 19th century and continuing into the 20th and 21st centuries, have uncovered hundreds of black granite statues depicting Sekhmet seated on a throne, her lion's head bearing the solar disk, her hands resting on her knees with a composed authority that gives no indication of what the texts record her having done. Some scholars estimate that the original installation at the site may have comprised more than 700 statues, one for each day of the Egyptian calendar plus its epagomenal days, installed as a permanent, rotating apparatus of placation, the theory being that if a different statue was offered ritual attention each day, Sekhmet's dangerous aspect might never be allowed to fully accumulate 700 statues. Not as celebration, as prevention. This is the part of the archaeological record that does not fit cleanly into a mythology framework and begins to suggest something else, a civilization that was not simply commemorating a story, but actively managing a risk it took to be real. The resources required to quarry, transport, carve, and install 700 granite statues of any kind were not trivial. Black granite granodiorite, specifically, in the case of many Sekhmet statues, came from the Aswan quarries, 500 miles south of Thebes. Moving it required boats, laborers, logistics, and the allocation of state resources at a level that required royal authorization. The pharaoh Amenhotep III, who ruled during the 18th dynasty in the period around 1380 BC, is credited in the archaeological record with a particularly extensive program of Sekhmet statue installation. This was not a private devotion. It was a public works project of significant scale, undertaken by one of the most powerful rulers in Egyptian history, for the explicit purpose of managing a divine force that his theological system identified as capable of ending the human world. Amenhotep III built more than almost any pharaoh before or after him temples, palaces, colossi, and among everything he built, he devoted a substantial portion of his state's resources to installing hundreds of stone representations of the goddess who had almost destroyed humanity. Because the record left by those before him was clear enough that he took it seriously. The question that follows from all of this, the one that the scholarship circles without fully settling, is what the myth was. Encoding. One line of interpretation treats the Sekhmet myth as a natural phenomenon account. The scorching heat of the Egyptian summer, when the Nile was at its lowest, and the desert winds came in from the west, and the sun seemed to press down on the land with something close to malice, this, in this reading, is Sekhmet's wrath. The annual period of maximum heat, when crops failed and disease spread, and the thin strip of cultivated land became temporarily inhospitable, was experienced as the eye of Re turned against its people. The festival of drunkenness, which took place at the end of this period, was a celebration of survival, the collective intoxication of a population that had made it through another year of what the climate of North Africa in the summer could do to everything alive within it. A second line of interpretation looks at the myth as a record of plague. Ancient Egypt was not immune to epidemic disease. The Nile, that source of all life, was also a vector standing water, dense agricultural communities, proximity to animals. The arrows of Sekhmet, the specific metaphor, the medical texts used for disease, may have been the cultural encoding of epidemic events that struck without warning, killed without apparent pattern, and eventually subsided in ways that could not be explained by the medical knowledge of the time. The beer, in this reading, was not a deception of a goddess. It was the ritual the surviving population used to mark the moment the disease stopped, transformed into a divine narrative to make it comprehensible and to make it repeatable as ceremony. The priests of Sekhmet, who functioned as physicians, were the people who had survived, who had accumulated enough knowledge of what worked to be useful to others, and who had organized that knowledge into a system that could be transmitted and refined across generations. A third interpretation, and perhaps the most difficult one, looks at the myth as a statement about power itself, about the nature of a force that can be created and cannot be recalled, that exceeds the authority of even the one who made it. Re creates Sekhmet to punish. He cannot stop her. He cannot command her. He can only trick her. And then he worships what almost destroyed him, because the alternative, pretending it cannot happen again, would be even more dangerous than the event itself. The hundreds of statues, the festivals, the priests, the whole apparatus of Sekhmet management that ancient Egypt maintained for over 2,000 years. This is a civilization that looked at what it knew about uncontrollable force and decided that acknowledgement was safer than denial. That the only way to live beside something capable of ending you is to never stop paying attention to it. The Book of the Heavenly Cow, which is the primary surviving source text for the Sekhmet myth, was found inscribed on the walls of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, specifically in the tombs of Seti I, Ramesses II, Ramesses III, and Ramesses VI. These were not obscure burials. These were the tombs of the most powerful men in one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world produced, buried with texts that described the moment their cosmology's supreme deity had failed to maintain control of what he created, and had only survived the consequences by flooding a field with beer and hoping that what was consuming the world would not notice the difference until it was too late. The decision to place this text in these tombs, not in a library, not in a temple archive, but in the burial chamber of the pharaoh himself, is not accidental. The Egyptians were not careless with what they put on tomb walls. Every image, every inscription, every text placed in that darkness was selected with intention. The text was placed where it was placed because the people who built these tombs believed it was something the dead king needed to know, something he would need wherever he was going to carry with him. A piece of information too important to leave behind. What is certain from the archaeological and textual record is that the Egyptians never stopped worshipping Sekhmet. Through the Old Kingdom, through the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, through the recovery of the Middle Kingdom, through the imperial expansion of the New Kingdom, through the Late Period, and the Persian occupation, and the arrival of the Greeks and the Romans, Sekhmet remained. Her statues were added to and maintained. Her festivals continued. Her priests kept their professional lineage alive across dynastic changes and political upheavals that erased entire systems of government and left nothing behind but stone. The lion-headed goddess, who the oldest texts recorded as nearly having destroyed everything, was still being actively worshipped when Egypt became a province of Rome in 30 BC, more than 2,000 years after the period in which the myth is believed to have first been recorded. 2,000 years of deliberate, institutionally organized attention to a force the civilization's own founding documents identified as having almost ended it. 2,000 years of beer and granite and priests and festivals, all oriented toward the same purpose, making sure that what happened once, according to the record, did not happen again. Not by denying that it could, not by rewriting the myth to make Re less fallible or Sekhmet less dangerous, by keeping the account intact and building a permanent infrastructure around it. The temple complex at Karnak, which is among the largest religious structures ever built on Earth, covering more than 200 acres at its peak, with construction and addition continuing across more than 2,000 years, contains, in the precinct of Mut, those hundreds of Sekhmet statues. They are still there. Many of them remain in situ. Others have been moved to museums in Cairo and Luxor and London and New York, but their existence is not disputed. They are there in the archaeological record with the same factual solidity as the Nile itself. Something about what the Egyptians believed regarding Sekhmet was real enough and urgent enough, and maintained across enough generations to produce that quantity of carved stone. And the stone is dark, and the faces of the statues are leonine and still, and the solar disk above each one catches light and holds it for a moment before releasing it back into the surrounding shadow, the same as it has done for 3,000 years, the same as it will do for whatever comes after the people who visit them now have also become dust. The dust that settles over the granite statues in the precinct of Mut at Karnak settles the same way it has settled for millennia. The air in the corridor between them is still and close and carries the smell of stone that has been in sun and shadow for so long it has absorbed something of both. Excavators working the site across the modern era have described a particular quality of quiet in that corridor, not absence of sound, but a kind of density to the silence, as if the space itself has retained something of the weight of what it was built to address. That may be interpretation rather than evidence, but the statues are there, the texts are there. The record of what the Egyptians believed and feared and chose to build rather than forget is there in the stone. And the question that sits at the center of all of it, the one that Ray seems to have asked himself in that moment when the fields went still and Sekhmet finally lay down and the land was quiet for the first time in however long the text declined to say, is the one the record leaves permanently open, not whether it can happen again. The Egyptians seemed quite certain it could. But why, in the first place, he made something capable of this? Why Re, in the oldest version of the account, created the eye, knowing what an eye, fully opened, might see, knowing what it might decide about what it saw. The text does not answer this. No surviving version of the myth does. It records the question, in its way, by recording everything that followed from the decision every festival, every statue, every jar of beer, every priest trained in negotiation with something that had already demonstrated it did not feel bound by negotiation, every generation that maintained the apparatus of appeasement, without questioning whether appeasement should be necessary. It records all of it, in limestone and granite and papyrus, and it leaves the first question standing, as if writing down what was created and what it did and what it cost to stop it and what was built afterward to prevent it from happening again, as if all of that recording was the only honest answer Ree could give, not an explanation, a record, left in the stone, in the dark. In the tombs of the people who understood that the most important information is the kind you do not look away from, what is also preserved in the record, and what receives less attention than the events of the myth itself, is the sheer geographic spread of Sekhmet's cult across the full span of Egyptian history. She was not a regional deity, worshipped in one nome or one city and unknown elsewhere. She was present across the entire length of the two lands, from the delta in the north to the first cataract at Elephantine in the south, the same location from which the plant that stopped her had been fetched. Her name appears in texts from virtually every period of Egyptian history for which significant textual evidence survives. She is mentioned in the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, those oldest surviving religious compositions carved into the burial chambers of pyramids at Saqqara. She appears in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, copied onto the interior walls of wooden coffins and onto papyrus rolls placed with the dead. She is present in the New Kingdom medical papyri, where the physicians who worked under her protection recorded their treatments and their prayers in the same document, understanding these as the same kind of activity. She is there in the late temples built under the Ptolemaic dynasty, when Greeks ruled Egypt and incorporated her into a theological system they were simultaneously adopting and reinterpreting. She endured across every transformation the civilization underwent, across every foreign occupation and every internal collapse and every period of reconstruction. Whatever she represented to the Egyptians, plague, heat, uncontrollable power, the necessary shadow side of a creative force, the thing that must be acknowledged because it cannot be denied. It was something they never stopped needing to acknowledge, and perhaps that is the strangest part of everything the surviving record contains. Not the lion-headed goddess descending with the authority of divine punishment behind her, not the fields of red stretching from one horizon to the other in the pre-dawn dark, not the God of creation watching what he made and finding himself, for all his power, unable to call it back. Not even the deception, the desperate, logistically precise deception of flooding the fields with something dyed to resemble what was already there and waiting in the dark to see if it would work. The strangest part is that it did work, and that Ray, looking at her, at the creature he had created and sent and could not stop and had only managed to trick into stillness, said that she was beautiful, and then built her temples and poured her festivals and maintained a priesthood in her name for the remainder of everything his civilization ever was, as if what had tried to end him was the most important thing he had ever made. As if losing control of it had not diminished, it had, in some way the theology does not explain directly, but the archaeological record seems to confirm across 3,000 years of stone, made it more worthy of attention than anything else he possessed. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, the ones that have survived in stone, when everything else has long since gone to dust, consider subscribing. There are many more that have yet to be fully understood.